Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Boldy James and Nicholas Craven record, Penalty of Leadership. Boldy James has been on a quality run since the start of 2020 that most musicians generally could only ever dream of. I mean, in that aforementioned year, he released The Price of Tea in China, a fantastic collaborative album with none other than the legendary producer The Alchemist, and since then he's released over a dozen projects that have all, for the most part, maintained that same high standard of quality that he's been setting for himself these past few years. I mean, it's been one excellent release after another in a more than steady release schedule, often with multiple releases throughout the year sprinkled about, and that includes records like 2020's Manger on McNichols, a collaboration with Sterling Tolles, a record that was extensively worked upon for years upon years upon years. 2021's very well beloved Bo Jackson, another collaboration with The Alchemist. 2022's Killing Nothing, one of my favorite rap albums of 2022, a collaboration with the ever underrated producer Real Bad Man, and a variety of other EPs that have been released over time that have really shown just how much Boldy James has been shining within the music industry over the course of the past few years. I mean, the guy's been active within music for quite a while at this point, but really, it's only been since the start of 2020 that he's truly shown just how he has become one of the greatest rappers out there at the moment. After a near fatal car crash at the beginning of 2023, however, it seemed like that run of excellent releases was going to understandably come to a halt. In fact, it probably would have for any other musician that wasn't an absolute machine in the same way that Boldy James is. However, here we are, beginning of 2024, and the man already has another album out, despite the fact it's only been a year since the incident that nearly could have taken his life, with another collaboration with the producer Nicholas Craven, who he previously worked on the very well-liked 2022 Fair Exchange No Robbery, one of the most highly praised albums that he put out throughout the past couple of years, and that's saying something considering pretty much everything Boldy has put out has been pretty well received overall. As you might expect from a record that was made in the midst of such a potentially life-changing series of events, Penalty of Leadership often feels very introspective in regards to its lyrical content, and I mean, as I said, that's to be expected. I mean, like I said, the guy was in a near-fatal car crash. That tends to make one a little bit existential here and there, and understandably so. As the record opens with the track Formal Invite, Boldy specifically states that he can still hear the air shocks from the trailer hitch on that semi, and with that opening bit of songwriting, it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the record, as you will find throughout the entirety of Penalty of Leadership, topics like suffering and recovery are recurring lyrical motifs that heavily fit into the same exact purpose of reflection and existentialism that, again, one would most likely expect from an album with the kind of context that this one has, and that reflection is heavily followed up on tracks like Brand New Chanel Kicks, with Boldy continuing to talk about things like recovering and getting back to where he is today, and sort of finally getting back to where he was before his life-altering near-deadly incident. That being said, it doesn't take up nearly as much of the lyrical content on Penalty of Leadership as you might actually expect. Meditations on life and mortality are certainly a fair chunk of Penalty of Leadership and its lyrical content found within, but at the same time, that isn't the majority of it. In fact, a huge amount of this album is pretty much directly intertwined with the same themes of crime and status symbols that have been directly involved with Boldy James's lyrical style since he first debuted well over a decade ago. There are even some tracks here like Evil Genius that kind of balance both ends of the spectrum here, with some lyrical moments that kind of highlight again those meditations on existence and his own life, whereas they at the same time have parallel verses that are more directly involved with the sort of seedy mafioso underground level of lyricism that you may have gotten on some previous Boldy James efforts that had a entirely different context behind them. And you know what? That isn't a bad thing. I mean, sure, you might go into this record knowing the story behind it and seeing the album cover of him in a stretcher going into an ambulance, but at the same time, Boldy James's lyrical abilities have always been a fairly noteworthy aspect of his style. In fact, with his monotonous delivery, that's always been a majorly highlighted quality of his entire brand as an artist, his entire unique personality within rap as a genre at the moment. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that he's, at least to an extent, sticking to his roots here. I mean, sure, maybe it's a bit odd to hear him go from something entirely new from him to something entirely the same, but at the same time, I don't really think it's a terrible thing to entirely, or at least partially, lean on something that's been successful for him in the past, especially when he's still not entirely leaning on or utilizing his prior lyrical styles as a crutch to kind of escape the topic that he's otherwise utilizing throughout this record. It's just that there are multiple sort of directions that he approaches this record from in terms of how he approaches songwriting. James's deadpan style has equally been a definitive quality of his entire personality and persona as a musician. In fact, I would argue that one of the first things that someone would take away from a record like, say, Manger on McNichols is the heartless, cold delivery that Boldy James presents himself as from song to song, not really coming across as a super emotionally movable dude, the sort of immovable object that's also an unstoppable force at the same time. It's definitely made for one of the most imposing figures within underground music in general at the moment, and it certainly works for him on the vast majority of the records that he puts out, and I would say, to an extent, it works here as well. I mean, the most traditional emotion that the guy will put into any given line throughout a song is when he asks, "Where we at the beginning, and then from there it's just all downhill in terms of how much emotion you can really take away from the rest of the verses in the song, but that's also how it's always been since the start of his career, at least for the most part, and it's always been something that has felt genuine coming from him, just a genuinely unique style that was entirely his, not some sort of fake or otherwise sort of derivative brand of flow that was taken from some other creative avenue. It's always been him, and that's undeniable. That being said, Penalty of Leadership does feel like an inherently emotional album, and his eyes glazed over kind of flow occasionally, and at that somewhat often, doesn't really work here. I mean, making the album art for your latest release after your car crash a sketch of you getting taken into an ambulance directly after your car crash, that tends to add a bit of emotional weight to the topic at hand. It's directly a part of the record and its many themes within, but when he so emotionlessly delivers songs like Soccer Mom and Murderous Tendencies, it kind of feels like he's not totally dedicated to the idea and concept going on here. He feels extremely reserved, and it makes for an album that's at least somewhat less striking because of it. Being intentionally emotionless is entirely respectable as a flow. It has worked for plenty of phenomenal rappers throughout history, and Boldy James is among those who I could list as someone who has created a cold and calculated delivery style and has made it work. However, Penalty of Leadership feels like it's trying to come across as more sentimental than the average Boldy James record, understandably so, considering the topic at hand, and that's fine. I'm actually more than okay with embracing that. I think it's great that he's occasionally trying to go in a different direction, even if not necessarily artistically, just in terms of how he delivers his songwriting. But when he just so casually delivers his own lyrics and does so in such a guarded way, it kind of feels like he can't fully express what he's trying to express here, if I'm even really correct in assuming that he's trying to express any particular emotion. It's genuinely kind of hard to tell at times. I mean, really, I'm more than okay with Penalty of Leadership being a more serious than average Boldy James record. I'm totally okay with the fact that he's trying to go in this direction. It's just that I feel like he needed some sort of revamp in terms of style to really make this album work in the way that I'm thinking he wanted it to. Penalty of Leadership is also Boldy James's first collaboration with producer Nicholas Craven since the aforementioned Fair Exchange No Robbery in 2022, and for those who aren't aware, Fair Exchange No Robbery, very well-received album, and understandably so, especially due to the excellent production value on that record. Craven's usage of cold bass instrumentals suited the entire style that Boldy James has become known for extremely well, yet at the same time the usage of strings and classic R&B samples gave a haunting tone that nicely went against everything that James's actual flow stood for. It was an album that was simultaneously lush and bare at the same time, an oxymoronic album, but an album that succeeded in its own lack of making sense. A similar sound is brought up on Penalty of Leadership, and it mostly manages to replicate those results, though somewhat lesser in terms of actual execution. It feels like a bit more of a flawed version of those production choices that I just mentioned. Much of the album has a fairly singular sound in that regard, though it's really hard to list that as a total negative considering this record's only 36 minutes long. It's not like it's a slog to get through or anything like that. The main criticism that I feel like one could reasonably make about Craven's actual production work here is that the classic R&B samples found here feel a touch more clumsy than they have in terms of previous Boldy James collaborations between the two. The Chipmunk Soul production style here is actually one that I'm personally very fond of, but at the same time, it does feel like songs such as Jack Frost, for example, are just way too clustered, way more clustered and awkward sounding than they really need to be, as they feel a bit all over the place in terms of vocal samples, and at times even interrupt Boldy James himself in a manner that can genuinely take the listener out of the general atmosphere of the track, leaving some songs, or at the very least certain passages here, feeling a touch more limp and a touch more lifeless than they really should end up sounding. If you compare the production on Penalty of Leadership to the production work on Fair Exchange No Robbery, it's definitely a downgrade. However, if you separate the two collaborations in question and just look at Penalty of Leadership as its own beast, which, I mean, you should, because it is its own beast, then the production here is fine. It's pretty solid overall. There are a couple of flubs here or there, but as a whole, I can't really fault it too terribly much, and Craven still is, from an atmospheric standpoint, a very talented producer. I just think that compared to previous work that the two here have done together, this is not the best output that they could have come up with. Penalty of Leadership is a very flawed record, but at the same time, it's still a solid album that continues that run of decent or better albums that we've been getting from Boldy James for the past few years, and I mean, hey, I guess I can't really complain about that. There certainly are a number of qualities worth picking apart here. I do feel that James's flow is just a bit too icy to really be fitting for the emotional and introspective impression that the record is seemingly trying to leave on the listener. And Craven's production here is still a step down from their previous collaborative work, despite being legitimately respectable and overall fairly solid. But nonetheless, those are legitimate flaws that I feel do hold this record back a fair bit. With all of that being set aside, however, Penalty of Leadership is still a solid, decently enjoyable, albeit highly imperfect record from Boldy James that marks a pleasant return for him, as well as a pleasant return for his duo work with Nicholas Craven after a terrible accident. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.